that way. And so I think we'll move on to our third and final presentation of this session. It's by Francis Barlas. Francis is a Senior Vice President and Chief Knowledge Panel Methodologist for Ipsos, and a research interest focused on survey measurement and online survey data quality. And Francis will be talking about beware the trapdoor. Can online probability sample data questions be improved using trap questions? Francis, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, quite well.
And you can see my screen?
We can, yes.
And it advances.
All three.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm very fortunate to be going after Nick because he started to lay some of the foundation for me and what I'll be talking about. I guess I'll kind of be putting a little bit of data around the conclusion that he draws, which is recommending not to use compliance or trap questions with probability-based panels. I'd like to acknowledge Randall Thomas, Ga Tang, Kathleen Santos, and John Lien for their help with this research. So at Ipsos, the probability-based panel that we work with is our knowledge panel, and we've seen an increasing interest in clients of ours looking to include trap questions as a measure of suboptimal response or an intention check in our surveys. And from a panel management perspective, as Nick was mentioning, it's concerned us a little bit, and we wanted to know a little bit more about what that means for our panelists' experience when they're coming across such a question. We are very concerned about possibly undermining our relationship with our panelists by implying that we don't necessarily trust them to be paying attention or giving us high quality data. We also are wondering, do they understand what they're being asked? And how do they feel about those types of questions? And then just, is it really associated with suboptimal response for a probability-based panel? So we conducted a study relatively recently. It came out of field mid-February with panelists on our knowledge panel. It was a short survey, 8 minutes, so admittedly a shorter survey in terms of thinking about attention checks. And it was an omnibus style survey that covered a number of different topics. And respondents were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. So a third of them did not see any trap questions. A third of them saw what we would call a more straightforward question, and then a third of them saw a trickier question. And I'll show you what those look like. So on the left here is the straightforward version of the question. We did also randomly assign people to which response option we were directing them to pick. So the first straightforward question said, to show that you are still reading these questions, please select the disagree or agree response below. And then the people in that straightforward condition, their second question was a little bit different. It said, this is an open item to confirm correct response presentation. Please select the sometimes true or very often true response below. And they were randomly assigned to just one or the other of those responses. And then the trickier version, it's the exact same question, except we just stuck a short sentence in front of the question. So at the top, political issues are important to many people. And at the bottom, people's experiences in the US vary. And these, I think, are admittedly a less trickier version. I've seen much harder and complex trap questions where there's maybe a full question and at the end of the question is the statement directing them to the response. So kind of telling them, regardless of how you'd want to answer this question, answer it this way. So this is trickier, but slightly less tricky than I've seen in the wild. And we also randomly assigned respondents who were in the trap question conditions to either see follow-up questions or not. And so if they were in the follow-up question condition, they immediately after getting that trap question, they were asked some reaction questions to the trap question. So they were asked just for their overall reaction to the prior question, was it positive, neutral, or negative? And then also if they had confusion about the purpose of the question. And then at the end of the survey, all respondents were asked about their survey experience without really mentioning the specific trap items. And so we had approximately 1,000 completes in each of the 3 conditions. I'll really be focused on the 2 trap conditions in this presentation. So the first results, we see that people were tripped up more by the trickier question. So more people failed the trickier trap question than the more straightforward question. In terms of looking at people who failed both of them, it's 2% for straightforward and 7% for the trickier. And we do see a little bit of a learning effect here in both of the conditions, where fewer people failed the second time they were presented with that type of question as compared to the first time they were presented with the question. So it seems like they got a little bit of a sense of what was happening and were better at answering the second question. If I look at the reaction to that first trap question, just at the overall level, we see that 8% of people had a negative reaction to the trap question, and about 18% of people were somewhat or very confused by the question. And if I break that out in terms of who passed or failed, we see that there's no significant difference in terms of failing or passing the question with their negative reaction, but people failed the question were much more likely to say that they were somewhat or very confused by the question. 40% of people who failed the question, failed the trap, said that they were confused by it. Interestingly, I didn't see any difference in terms of reaction for the straightforward or tricky. They didn't have a stronger negative reaction to the tricky, and they weren't more confused by it compared to the straightforward. And the results for the second trap question are pretty similar, although these are people who, again, didn't kind of learn from that first experience. They didn't benefit from that learning. So we see even higher rates of confusion among these people who failed the second trap question. And again, no difference between the straightforward and the tricky. In terms of who failed the trap questions, we see a relationship, a mild relationship with age, where older people are a little bit more likely to fail the trap question, and people with less than a high school degree, over a quarter of them failed a trap question. No difference by gender. And then we also see people with lower income being more likely to fail the one of the trap questions. In terms of the overall assessment at the end of the survey that didn't refer at all to trap questions, we do see some significant differences by whether or not they passed or failed the questions. We don't see any difference in terms of the tricky versus the straightforward, but people who failed the questions were less likely to say that their responses were very accurate. They were more likely to say that they found the survey to be somewhat or very difficult, and less likely to say that their answers to the questions were very clear, or that they found the questions to be very clear. And then I also just wanted to see, is this really a measure of suboptimal response? So I separated the fastest 5% of completes. And what I found was that in terms of passing or failing just one of the questions, there's no difference there. About 5% of each of those conditions were in the fastest 5% of completes. But those who failed both were much more likely to be in the fastest 5% of completes. So there is a little bit of a relationship there with what might be a more traditional measure of suboptimal response, the rate of speed through the survey. So kind of overall conclusions, the trap questions may not fully be a measure of attention. We see the learning effect where people are less likely to fail that second question, which means that it maybe isn't necessarily assessing attention, because if it was really a measure of attention, we would expect a higher rate of failure at the second question as attention starts to wane throughout the survey. And also people who failed the questions were more likely to indicate that they were confused by the question. We do though see a higher rate of speed among those who failed both of them. So that is some indication that there's at least a bit of a relationship to suboptimal responding there. But given the negative reaction and the confusion, we do have a little bit of concern about including these questions in our surveys. This was just a one-time survey and an 8-minute question, but if we do this repeatedly, if we have more and more of our clients interested in putting these questions on the survey, we're concerned about kind of what that cumulative experience might be for our panelists. And also, we do see that the types of people who fail these questions tend to be people who have higher rates of non-response generally. So we really need to be concerned about, one, upsetting them if they're going to drop from the panel more quickly. And two, if we do start to use this as a measure for data cleaning, we could be exacerbating non-response. And that's really where we want to take the research next, is to look at what happens to our estimates when we remove these people from our surveys, to see if we really are improving bias by using these attention checks. And that's what I have for you. Thanks so much for your time.
Great, thanks, Francis. Questions for Francis, either through the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. One chat question from Kathleen. Let's see, my screen just changed. To what extent are chat questions essentially cognitive? This is also what I was going to ask. Is it a cognitive test, or is it a test of attention sometimes when we're asking these types of questions? And
Yeah.
to that effect, do we really, are we concerned at all about seem to be low income, low education, which would suggest that it might be more cognitive than attentional?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a big concern for me as well, that it's not necessarily measuring what we think it is. It to us might seem straightforward that it's an attention check, but for people who don't think in the world of survey questions and who aren't used to thinking like we do, they may just really be confused or not really understand what we're asking them to do. There's one common type of question that's kind of a fact-based or knowledge test, and that could very well be more of a cognitive test. I saw one example that was something like the sun rises and you're supposed to pick the correct direction. And it's not necessarily the case that if you get that wrong, it means you're not paying attention. And my dog wants to join the session. Apologize.
He passes the attention. But similar to that, do you have any potential measures of cognitive ability that you might correlate this pattern of failing attention checks with, and test it more directly, perhaps?
It's a good question. I mean, education was meant to be that. I don't know off the top of my head if I have any other measures of cognitive ability that I could think of beyond that. I'm sure I could come up with some if I spent some more time thinking.
Sure. Kathleen, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I think actually you read Margaret's question, not my question. So my question was, did you have any trap questions without the follow-up questions? Because I was wondering how much like the follow-up questions sort of flagged that there was something unusual about the previous question. They might not have even noticed or learned, how to deal with the tricky questions later because of it.
Yeah, and we did include a condition that didn't have the follow-up. And so what I need to do next, so that I've only had the data for a couple of weeks, but what I need to do next is really dig into the experience of those people, as well as the people who didn't see any trap questions at all, and really try and parse out what the differences are in those conditions. And I briefly mentioned that we had a random assignment of disagree or agree. So there's another interesting question around response order effects, and if they're getting told to be picked one earlier versus later in the assignment, what that might do to the likelihood of failing. So I've got a number of different things I need to dig into in here. But yeah, we shared your concern about possibly drawing attention to it, and that's why we had some of them not get the follow-up questions.
Great. Well, thanks very much. That essentially brings us to time. So I want to thank all the presenters for a very engaging discussion, and thank you for sharing your work, and for everyone for participating in this panel. So I'll now turn it over to our final panel of the day, and Gary Matola, who will be our moderator. So Gary.